Thank you. Very happy to be here. And let me start off by remarking straight away that his title, which I feel like, as I was writing up the presentation, I realized, well, maybe the title would have been an internal external distinction as a pathway to philosophical progress, perhaps even more aptly, an eclectic set of reflections based on Carnap's internal external distinction and some personal insights from the practice of logic as a pathway to philosophical progress. So explication, well, will still be important in the background. The notion of Carnapian explication in the sense of the place we debate content by well-defined ones. And then mostly be drawing on the internal-external distinction, given the extent to which these two ideas are methodological cognates. I still feel the title is apt enough as far as it goes, but I wanted to have given this disclaimer before moving on. So, overview. In the first part, I remarked on the lack of progress in philosophy and identify an approach to overcoming this, which will have two problems. These problems I suggest they be overcome, or we might find inspiration for how to overcome these problems by drawing on a case study from 20th century developments in logic, very much in the Carnapian spirit. Thirdly, dealing with this case study in more general accounts will be proposed, and then in the very end, I will apply this, will sketch how to apply this to the realism debate. So I'll say also at the outset that what I'll have to say about realism here is relatively brief, but I look forward to hearing your thoughts also on how the general account I sketch may be developed further in the context of the realism debate. Okay, so first part. So I will just put this here as a claim. I know that yesterday as well, we heard a lot of diverging views on this. I will put this here as a claim that there has been a conspicuous lack of progress in philosophy. I have two quotes here from Glover, all the apparent lack of clear progress, an embarrassment. Chalmers more recently has, in a more neutral language, noted that there has not been a large collective conversion to the truth on the big question of philosophy. So I'm very happy to also discuss more about this assertion. I will take it here as a given, and in light of that fact, see what you might have to say about that. So various explanations for lack of progress have been put forward in the literature. Some of these are from Chalmers, some of others are, it's a very nice book collecting a lot of these reflections on the supposed lack of progress. So we have candidates such as there simply are no philosophical truths, or evolutionary arguments saying that humans evolved to be good at philosophy. And then there's also, when by Chalmers, philosophical methods cannot compel agreement. And also a classic, a lot of philosophical problems are verbal disputes. So these last two lack of a method to compel agreement, and preference of verbal disputes will inform what I want to say here. So let me put forward the Carnapian diagnosis, the lack of progress. Philosophical debates fail to see much progress because philosophers conflate logical / factual statements with expressions of personal value judgment. Two quotations by Carnap. I'll read first. So from his polemic 1952 paper from to Heidegger, ending the paper by saying that the pseudo statements of metaphysics serve for the description of states of affairs. They serve for the expressions of the general attitude of a person towards life. A very similar idea and in a very different context, and but in a very different terminology. That invaded a Carnap in the famous paper in Empiricism and Method Ontology, where meta debate twine and the abstract objects. He also places value on clearly distinguishing questions that are internal to frameworks and questions that are internal to frameworks, that is only internal questions to which we can provide clear true or false judgments. External questions, to the extent that they are valid questions at all, are merely questions of practical value judgments. I'm really good value judgment, but it's a matter of choosing which linguistic framework in this context is the most practical for us to adopt given our priorities as inquiring agents. So this is me channeling the Carnappian spirit and the Carnappian diagnosis of progress. So with this diagnosis comes the remedy. Instead of just adopting what one might call a traditional view where to resolve the disagreement between philosophers and general is to either identify a false premise or a mistaken instance step. I call it here deflationary. I'm not committed to the label. So in any case, this alternative view we have here suggests that maybe explicit frameworks, two frameworks, W1 and W2, and sets of values, V1 and V2, such that in a broad sense, we can see that V1 motivates framework 1. We can see that the second set of values motivates framework 2, and we show how each claim emerges as a result of following through with the rule of inference and premises of the different frameworks in question. I should also say I'm at this point already going explicitly beyond Carnap, so it's Carnappian but not Carnap's. So this particular diagnosis, it's also not particularly unique to Carnap. So note that I haven't, in my description just now, committed to the frameworks being linguistic frameworks. They can be, but we can also substitute here other concepts. So following von Frazen, in light of the theme of the conference, you can also just think of the frames in question as stances, articulated and of course in the context of the realism debate. But even in Kuhn already, we can also substitute the concept of paradigm instead of the generic term framework here. And well, it would be a meta-philosophical variant of Kuhn, but in that case, a very similar view on how to resolve these disagreements emerges. But like I said, well, there's at least two problems to identify with this remedy, supposed remedy, two disagreements. Or proposal for overcoming disagreements, perhaps I should say. So here are the two problems I have in mind. So one, what is the nature of the relation between values and the frameworks engendered by them? So we might think here as well in the stance debate, what is the relation, exact relation between the values and the stances that these values give rise to? Is it only the values that give rise to stances or other first order beliefs implicit there? And the second problem, and this is truly a classic, at least since the days of Kuhn, but probably much more distant if we want to look further. But how, if at all, are we able to rationally compare different frameworks, given the fact that we acknowledge that the choice of a framework is essentially based on value judgments? So, as you mentioned, let me tell you a bit about this case study about disagreements about what constitutes the right system of logic. This is a case study that I have in mind. And well, let me now go with this example, and then in the remainder I'll tell you what insights I brought from this. So, background, as mentioned, this is the question at hand. What is the one true system of logic? Take this to be the question logicians or philosophers might discuss and argue about. One common answer is encapsulated by the first order thesis. So the claim that classical first order logic is the one right system of logic. We have a quote here from logician John Barwhite, who diagnosed why who claimed why this thesis rose to prominence in 20th century philosophy. Okay, so a challenge, of course, to this first order thesis, and you will be aware, is the fact that, well, we have a great few alternative systems of logic. A lot of different examples could be listed here. Logic that allows different types of quantification, higher order predicate logic, modal logics, fuzzy logics, etc., etc. The point being, given this plurality of logical systems, which was especially brought about and were especially pressing also in the community of working mathematicians and people working on model theory and logic more broadly, was the population explosion in logical systems that we saw in the 1980s, brought about also by development of computer science, the example of Southern logics already just now. So in light of this development, this question became pressing. Well, what grounds do we have, if any, for further privilege status for first order logic? So what happened? Well, in response, not just one, but a variety of meta-level frameworks were available, where people would talk about not just concrete examples of logical systems, so a meta framework for comparing properties of, say, first order logic, second order logic. These frameworks also allow them to talk about logics in the abstract. So you would have things like, for any logic L, define property so and so to consist in followed by a number of mathematical requirements put on this abstract definition of logic. Like I said, there are various flavors of these frameworks, and it's truly astonishing how many there emerge. So you have set theoretic. So you have ones employing different tools. So the most common is set theoretic frameworks. You also have type theoretic and category theoretic ones. And you also find different perspectives on logic. So logic in the sense of consequence operators, or in the more traditional proof theoretic sense, and indeed in the sense of model theory. My focus here will be with particular model theoretic framework, also known as abstract model theory. And what I want to do now is reflect on how this framework, how we can use this framework to then adjudicate this disagreement about what might be the one true system of logic. So consider toy disagreements. Logician 1 says first order logic is the best logical system and it's the most well behaved. Logician 2 says no, it's not true at all. It can't even acclimatize piano arithmetic. Second order logic is much better. Logician 1 said, well, that might be so, but that's not really a valid point against first order logic. Logician 2 says no, it is because it's circular arguments. Logician 1 says no, you're wrong because it's circular arguments. So classic templates that we've seen many times over in lots of different. So how does this model theoretic framework serve to deflate types of disagreements like this? Well, this already it allows us to translate in very precise terms the ill-defined qualifications. So first order logic is the most well-behaved, becomes expressible as first order logic satisfies numerous properties such as the countable compactness property, the downward load and slope property, and many other metalogical properties that almost universally agreed among logicians are now using now. If you're not familiar with these terms, that's okay. We won't need to know too much about the details of the actual properties involved here. Okay. Only the facts that they are formally expressible within this metalogical framework. So similarly, second order logic can do much more. We might translate that as second order logic is stronger than first order logic in the sense that every sentence in first order logic, for every sentence, there is another sentence in second order logic such that the two sentences are logically equivalent. In this example, it's a very trivial case if you can just take the new sentence and you can show that you can't do it the other way around. So the second order logic you have second order quantification. Okay, so this is already first step that we need precise nature of the claims involved. So there's already enough thoughts, seemingly factual dispute over the one between system of logic being asked as a practical dispute over which kinds of methodological properties are desirable for a logic to have. Of particular interest here is the fact that abstract model theory allows you to do a lot more with the level of rigor it affords us. In particular, it allows us to formulate characterization theorems. And the foundational example here, which is what gives rise to all the fields of abstract model theory, is this theorem of Lindström, saying that first order logic, in fact, is the strongest system of logic that is countermove back and has the downward Lowenheim-Stollen property. In other words, it's the strongest logic that has these two highly desirable methodological properties. So in this case, we see an example of how different practical commitments to uniquely determine the logic system at hand, provided we are interested in having a strong logic that we can given our constraints. Okay. So how might this? I'm actually going a lot after. So that might be more question for Q&A in that case. Okay, so let's reflect a bit then on how this example and this case study might inform more general perspective on overcoming disagreement in general, in particular, and then more specifically in the context of the realism debate. So to do this, I want to highlight two particular aspects about the disagreement between edition 1 and edition 2. So in the reconstruction we gave, the first logician could be seen to prefer first or second order logic on the basis of the former satisfying certain bigger monadic properties, certain methodological properties like this compactness property that the latter is. So here's one highly desirable property. You may or may not think much should have this, but I'm going to assert now that it should for these various practical reasons. Mindset of logician 1. By contrast, logician 2 prefers second order logic over first order logic on the basis of there being this binary preference relation that we can use to order different systems of logic, in this particular case, ordering them on the basis of their logical expressive strength. And this particular hierarchy is of such a high-level nature that we can frame it as general preference relation among the two things. So where we might say for the property of expressive strength, all things being equal, if we have two different systems of objects, and instead of getting all of them are equal, so other methodological properties are equal, then it might make sense for strong logic. Okay, so what I want to say here now, and what I want to generalize from is the observation that the strength of abstract model theory, and you can find this in some of these other abstract frameworks as well, lies in the fact that it provides us with a rigorous way of assessing how first this general preference relation interacts with specific meta-level properties that a practitioner may or may not place personal, aesthetic, or practical value in. Right? So this distinction is important for follow. So there's this general preference relation in the case of logic, expressive strength, and then there are these more specific meta-level properties like causal compactness, the Lowenheim-Stollen property, as well as many others, that you as a practitioner may or may not decide to place value in. And the interesting question then is, given that we're invested in having both nice meta-level properties as well as satisfying our general purpose relation, how do these two trade off against each other? So how strong can logic be if we start losing interesting, desirable, those meta-level properties? Yes, so what I think is just summarized. So to emphasize, so these two observations now, so building on what I just said, these two observations show us also how we may address the two outstanding issues, which is going on between disagreements that I highlighted at the beginning. What's the relation between values and between the frameworks they render, and how also, given the fact that frameworks are, the chosen frameworks are its value dependent, right? How does this enable, if at all, a rational comparison between different frameworks? So in this particular case study, C provides us with a framework or a meta-level framework provides us with a precise understanding of how one's meta-level value is determined on such a framework. It does so in both a weak sense, so we can simply say that, well, I'm committed to this logic having this property. In fact, well, you know, the logic has this property. We can make a framework, the meta-level framework. But it can also do it in a strong sense, in the generalization terms, saying that, well, if I'm committed to these particular values, in this case, the two meta-level logical properties I discussed, then I can rigorously show there's a unique choice of framework that satisfies these values. So that's one. It also allows for rational comparison in one conceptual rationality. So, what it allows us to do, it provides a rigorous preference relation, which allows us to ground the notion of practice, which allows us to ground the notion of rationality, think of what it means to rationally for one framework over another framework. So in this case, how might one then, given the facts that the choice of protocol logic is purely dependent on practical consideration of these two methodological properties, well, how is then rational, given the fact that it was ostensibly just a preference? Well, we can then invoke this characterization term that I showed. Well, actually, we can show that if we're invested in this property, then it is rational to adopt protocol logic because there is no stronger system of logic that can have both. So in this way, the two problems that I signaled for this strategy of overcoming disagreements in the way that it manifests in this logic case study, in this way, in a sense, its mathematical framework enables us to provide elements to the two problems. Okay. So building each observation and case study, consider now following extension of the inflationary approach to overcoming philosophical disagreements. So this was where we were, this was where we left off. And in principle, it's also totally fine to leave off here if you're not bothered by any of the problems that were mentioned at the outset. But if you're looking for a more fruitful way overcoming the disagreement rather than just saying, well, it's always value dependent. Here's one suggestion for doing that, informed by everything I just said. So identify a meta language such that philosophers one, so now we're back to the philosophers disagreeing, such that philosophers one and philosophers two both accept a meta language as a language which describe meta level properties about their respective frameworks. Then we require that the meta language defines a preference relation over the frameworks in question, such that both philosopher one and philosopher two agree that all things being equal, it is rational for one framework over another. Oh yeah, well, the order is inverse here. So that's just notation. So it's rational to prefer one framework over another if there's then the appropriate order relations given by our general relation of preference among frameworks. Then thirdly, the sets of values that both philosophers uphold, V1 and V2 corresponds. Sets P1, P2 of the monadic, you might also be binary or higher, or properties with higher error be there. Now, like the monadic properties, so translate set of values to set of properties. that are predicated over framework 1 and framework 2 in the meta language. So again, to make it a bit tractable, right? So if the value is here, I want the logic as well behaves, then the set of properties here will include vagueness and load and so on. So these are the requirements for the meta language. So that's step 1, finding meta language all these properties, and then second, show that framework 1 is the most preferable framework relative to this preference relation, satisfying all the properties in P1. So this will give you the result that it's rational, given your value system, to adopt this particular framework. And you do the same thing for framework 2. And then what this is all intended to accomplish is that if you're then a philosopher in dispute with the other, and you think they're very wrong for adopting the framework that they have, you can still say that, okay, well, at least given your value system, I can see why you would think so and so. And that's basically what it's meant to accomplish. Okay, good. So there's a disclaimer here. Some of you might already that might have come to mind already, and I was going over all the things that I require this meta language to satisfy. Saying that, well, this proposal will do little to modify a radical skeptic who doubts the very existence of a neutral meta language on which both parties in the dispute can agree on a principled basis. So all the things that I said here about how much you have to agree on, you might just be saying, well, it's very nice, but there's no principled reason for why it's ugly. So I will take that, I acknowledge that criticism, and I take it in stride. So at the end of the day, the book really does stop at this point in the disagreement. However, and I say take it in stride, not as a way to wave the principal criticism away, but because I'm interested in the question, given this principle, this principle's observation about the fundamental nature of this agreement, given that, what can the practice, in this case, the practice of logicians, teach us about how to more fruitfully disagree in particular intellectual contexts? People may want to press me on this. They're welcome to. Okay, now this is the last part, also the sketchiest part of this presentation. So, as I say here, I'm applying it to the realism debate, and in this sense, I've become a bit more pessimistic than I was in my abstract. So, it's a very much work in progress. So, rather than when I set out this project, I felt based on initial results, I felt optimistic that I could relatively straightforwardly apply this framework to the debate and then have a more fruitful way of disagreeing. I've now arrived at a different, but hopefully equally insightful diagnosis of the situation. So rather than show how this approach, so this deflationary approach to disagreeing that I just sketched, so rather than show how this may be used to overcome the dispute, I will use it to guide in this wider debate. In its current form, at least, cannot be completely overcome in the way that the debate about the wrong right logic can be. So this will bring us to a familiar conclusion, namely that this disagreement cannot be overcome with at least some common ground between different disputes in question. However, it is in specifying that the form that this common ground should take, that I take the deflationary approach to be of value. So yes, familiar conclusion, we need common ground, but the nature of this common ground, you might get some insights on. So how to even start with recasting the realism debate in terms like this, given the fact as well what I just that requires a fair bit of formalization of the position involved. So here, this is not at the core of my argument today, but nevertheless, as a point of departure for casting the debate in terms that are amenable to the analysis I sketched. So as my point of departure for doing that, I take Hans Halverson's proposal of conceiving of the scientific realism debate as a dispute over the right notion of theoretical equivalence. So here we see him in the book, The Logic and Philosophy of Science, suggesting that the debate can be frequently construed as a battle over central theoretical equivalence. In particular, a realist is somebody who adopts or recommends that people adopt stricter standards of theoretical equivalence. Conversely, an anti-realist is somebody who adopts or recommends people adopt looser standards theoretical equivalence. If people have any views on the inadequacy of this characterization, we'll bring that up in the Q&A. So given this point of departure, consider then a reconstruction, a very toy reconstruction of a disagreement between an instrumentalist, generic realist, and structural realist. So instrumentalist might here say, based on my values, like my systems of metaphysics and admiration of the positive sciences, I take two theories to be equivalent if they have the same empirical content. Now, we're very similar, different, based on very different sets of value judgments. The generic realists arrives at the judgment that two theories are if they have the same consequence altogether. And the structural realists, for additional context, might say that their beliefs in general view that two theories are equivalent to the same structural context. So, familiar enough way of repassing positions, I hope. So, where does this way of conceiving this agreement then lead us in with regards to the general framework? Well, and this is what I just said as well. So this is one of the cases where the fruitful disagreement just stops at point one. So we articulate our motivations for adopting the particular notion of theoretical equivalence that we do. And then we show how particular claims we make about the theory, the relation between science and the world follow from that. It doesn't, so it does not allow for more fruitful condition at this point of the disagreement. Why not? Oh, okay. There we go. Yeah, no, I'll leave it like this. So why not? And here I want to drive home then the analogy with what I think to be the fruitful case study from logic, the logic case. So, well, the first thing we need to do is identify a fruitful meta language for comparing different notions of theoretical equivalence. You might think that first for a model theory or another type of model theory, but if you want to use category theory for this, I do the trick. So what is it that we then want in our general scheme? Well, like I said, we want a general relation with which to order different notions of theoretical equivalence by some general standard of preferability. Well, we have a candidate for that in the context of these provisional meta-level frameworks. Well, not really. So you can, for example, say that, well, an equivalence relation, a notion of theoretical equivalence is preferable to another if it is more fine-grained than the other. That won't quite do because how fine-grained our notion of equivalence should be is, of course, a very question that is at stake in the realist debate altogether. So there's no forthcoming useful way to cash out this preference relation. What we also want, so what we have instead is some very weak necessary conditions at any. So in this sense, you have some preference relations that at any logic not satisfying very weak necessary conditions, or any notion of equivalence, I mean, is not a stable candidate for a notion of theoretical equivalence. So if you have a notion of equivalence that where two theories are equivalent, but it does not follow that they're both consistent, so one is consistent and the other inconsistent, then it's not a particularly good notion. It's not a particularly good notion of theoretical equivalence. So we have weak necessary conditions like that, but we don't really have a stable or general preference relation like we had in the logic case. And then this is the final thing I'll say. Cap off with then the diagnosis of the debate. So this was a point about the preference relation. There's also a point about how we translate our values into meta level properties. So what we want is the translation of values into the meta level framework, like model theory, such that it does not contain irreducible reference constants in a meta language. I might need to explain that. And well, I do that as follows. Consider this proposal. So an equivalence relation satisfies the instrumentalist stance. Take this to be the codification of the values. If and only if our equivalence relation is the notion of observational equivalence, like I sketched here. But of course, that's not a very good way of backing out what this set of values, of translating this set of values, because it's a very circular way of incorporating or encoding the values into your framework. Where you're basically saying, well, observational equivalence follows the preferred equivalence relation from my stance because it does, you know? So if you compare this to this property of compactness, of boundary compactness that I cited several times before, you can see you have a very general way of codifying this meta-level desideratum in a way that does not make explicit reference to the system of logic in question. So you could have said here, well, a logic, my value that the logic is well behaved is translated as the fact that the logic is equivalent to further logic, then you will be doing what you're doing. So that's what I mean by referring to a constant in the language. Again, it makes reference to one particular framework, either to one particular equivalent relation or one particular notion. So that's my diagnosis, and I will leave it at that.